So what we'll cover today is 5 easy ways to implement tips for communicating with the public. We're going to kind of pair it with a few live figure makeovers that seems to be pretty popular with all of you. So we're going to dive into the application and kind of apply some of the theory and practice. Okay, and what this webinar will not be, as I mentioned, is a sort of a detailed tutorial on how to use BioRender. If you're curious on how to use the tool, you are welcome to join our Wednesday webinars. This is where we sort of dig into the BioRender application itself and all of its capabilities. We'll link that in the follow-up email to this webinar, and we'll also sort of link it at the end of this webinar if you're interested to sign up. So a few common use cases for BioRender, for those that are familiar, you'll already know that BioRender is a tool for use in many scientific outputs. Here's a list of those use cases, but one that might be less known, but becoming ever more popular, is to create figures intended for the public or lay audiences, which is sort of the topic of today. So a very quick background about myself. My name is Shiz. I'm one of the co-founders of BioRender here. If we haven't already met, I did my training at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine through their medical and biological illustration program. And then I went over to National Geographic at their headquarters in Washington, D.C. To work as a science illustrator. And, our primary audience there was, of course, the 40 million readers a month that spanned from, scientists and science communication enthusiasts like yourselves, all the way down to 5-year-olds who were just looking to our magazine to find, inspiration. And we've worked on, hundreds of really interesting stories, everything from showing how the chameleon changes their color in response to temperature, environment, and mood, to showing how the fastest shark in the world produces burst speeds of, up to 50 miles per hour in some cases. So the visuals we created had to be, very concise. They followed very strict guidelines of being, both communicative and accurate, but also approachable for the widest range of audiences possible. And of course, this was accomplished with, effective visuals, simplified text and labels, and sort of an empathy-focused design approach. So the big question is, why is it important to effectively communicate to those outside of the scientific community? Well, the majority of the world is not science literate, even though we obviously love them to be. In fact, not only are they not science literate, there's actually a sweeping infodemic, what they're calling it, in this age of sort of misinformation. If anyone follows tennis, this guy is probably the top 3 tennis players in the world, is what I'm told, if not the best in some rankings. So unfortunately, he's used his platform to claim that he is an anti-vaxxer and that he refuses to return to tennis if he's required to take the COVID-19 vaccine. I saw this in the news yesterday and I was pretty horrified. Another article from Vice talking about how anti-vaxxers are terrified that the government will enforce a vaccine for coronavirus on them. So for me, these headlines terrify me. And we're not going to claim to solve this problem in the 1 hour we have together, but I think we all sort of feel a sense of responsibility to do our part in adding truth to these conversations. And again, oftentimes it must be in the form of, better science visuals. And I'm going to show you examples of that as we go through. Here's another kind of sobering comment from the UN about how, again, our common enemy is, of course, COVID-19 right now, the virus itself, but also the infodemic of misinformation. So, we have a lot of work to do as far as not only getting the vaccine and the science out, but, also communicating to those that, we need their participation for. So with that, how can we contribute again to the conversation and use our platform to channel all our efforts to try and communicate science, which can be very scary for most people who aren't in the sciences. Our job is to make our audience feel smart, not confused and dumb, And now again, I can't claim to be an expert in creating written content for the public, but I can hopefully dispel some advice about how to create more effective visuals for non-scientific audiences. Um, so these are the sort of 5 tips that I've tried to summarize. I probably had a list of 50 that I wanted to share today, but for the sake of time, we've reduced it to 5. Maybe we'll do a follow-up or more digestible tips in shorter clips. But here are the 5 that we'll go through, and I'll repeat these throughout so you don't have to write anything down. And again, we'll have this recorded to send out later on. So here's the first tip. That is to use sort of relatable visual analogies. Many of you might already do this, but it's good to remind ourselves that metaphors and puns go a really long way, even for technical audiences. So I like to use visual puns to kind of add a bit of a interest or splash of excitement during what could be a pretty boring presentation. Um, Here's an example. If you're in the neurosciences, you're probably used to talking about, disintegration of myelin or neurons or neural connections or synapses. For this particular example, the pathology or progression of Alzheimer's disease is, pretty obvious in the left-hand panel. But if you dig down to the sort of cellular level, it starts to get a really abstract for non-technical audiences. So what I like to do is sometimes throw in pictures that, obviously people can relate to, um, but also that are sort of, everyday household items. So even something like this, which is, sort of a Apple iPhone charger that's been kind of shredded up there. It's not an exact one-to-one comparison, but it certainly does at least make that visual connection and immediately allows your audience to think, okay, there must be some sort of break in the electrochemical signals, or the conduction of electricity in some way is quite similar to what's happening from a neural to neural synapse. So again, using everyday household items to make those connections, even for non-technical audiences. And going back to the example I showed previously of the types of figures that we created for things like National Geographic when I worked there, we actually elaborated on this figure to create sort of a supplemental animation to describe for kids why it's important and why it's interesting as to why the mako shark is the fastest shark in the world. So this is kind of a comparison. At the time, I think Michael Phelps was really in the headlines and making a splash because of all of the gold medals he was winning. So here it is on the Nat Geo website. So basically what we did was we took, what's kind of an abstract concept, like the short fin mako and the great white shark, and we threw in Michael Phelps and these fish into a swimming pool and tried to show that, as fast as we think Michael Phelps is, this is how much faster the fish are. So, I don't know about you, but, as somebody with a scientific background, I still thought that this is pretty cool to show these relatable concepts the way they were. So again, what could have been a pretty abstract or unrelatable concept, I thought was really neat to show, again, relatable concepts. So things like a school bus, sometimes we'll even show size or length just by using sort of vector symbols next to, more complex concepts. I won't continue the video, but you're welcome to watch it on the Nat Geo website. So again, using relatable concepts and bring it back to reality, or whatever is sort of in the media at the time. So that was the first tip. The second tip is defining sort of the hero versus the villain in your story. So that relates to using the correct color and imagery. And this is particularly important, especially because we're often actually defining the hero or protagonist and the villain or the antagonist in the story that we communicate, without ever actually knowing it. And I'll explain why. Here's a pretty common image if you work in maybe immuno-oncology or immunology or cancer biology of, several different leukocytes, lymphocytes, dendritic cells, macrophages, um, attacking a cancer cell. So this is great. On first glance, however, um, if you didn't have labels and you didn't know the science, it's probably pretty scary looking. These kind of invasive looking alien things are attacking this, poor cell at the bottom, when in fact it's actually the opposite of what you want to feel sympathy for. There's actually the antagonist and protagonist here are reversed. So super quick, swap of colors automatically changes, it's a bit subconscious, as I mentioned, but it does something to kind of tell the story a little bit better. So we've made the cancer cell here this sort of invasive dark red color, and then all the good guys or the heroes of the story are this kind of blue color palette. It's similar to why, hospital walls are painted blue and not red, because it's much more soothing of a color and a lot less anxiety provoking to have, cool color palettes represent the good guys, and then, these kind of warmer, sort of reddish hues to denote, the pathology or the disease that you're fighting. So just keep that in mind when you're using color. It's really powerful and can be used to your advantage. It can also, make or break a story if not used correctly. I would also avoid showing photos that are too realistic when you're speaking to non-technical audiences. Um, this is why showing schematic versions of a concept is much more effective than showing sort of the full, gory, detailed story of, for example, maybe a surgical process. I was actually helping out a medical tech startup, and the founders were, really excited about showing their new technology that sort of laser pointed into the patient's diseased area. And I had to tell them that if you showed this to a non-scientific investor or maybe their patient and their family, they'd probably feel quite uncomfortable. And you'd even start to feel a bit sorry for the patient. It looks pretty painful. So, again, this is likely to be more on a sort of subconscious level. Um, but it can actually tell a very powerful story and send powerful signals to the brain, of who to trust, what is ultimately good or bad for me. And sometimes it does require even a professional medical illustrator to help you come up with the best ways to visualize unique concepts, especially if you're working on sort of unique medical devices or sort of pieces of equipment that don't actually exist on the market today. So yeah, maybe we could have avoided this kind of a really detailed, gory photo. It also might be worth noting, and I don't know why we don't talk about this more often, but apparently approximately 1 in every 10 Americans suffer from some form of trypanophobia. Um, this is sort of the fear of needles, and it actually could be the reason why a lot of patients forego vaccines or medical treatment altogether. Um, so I would love to kind of bring this discussion to the forefront. Obviously not today, but it's something that I like discussing. This is why when I describe sort of vaccines or medications for a lay audience, I'll sometimes omit the needle completely or even reduce the size of the needle enough that it does not become the main event in the visual story. Because going back to the sort of protagonist, antagonist, the needle can actually symbolize a villain in the story for people who are actually afraid of them. So, we'll apply this kind of hero versus villain tip in practice when we jump into the demo, but just, keep this in mind that you could be unintentionally um, scaring your audience without knowing it. So tip number three, I like to look to other public-facing specialties. These include medical legal and patient education and even investor pitch decks. So you're not the only ones in the world that need to kind of clarify concepts that are in the scientific realm for audiences that aren't technically savvy. So the two examples that I mentioned are medical legal and patient education. If you haven't encountered these specialties in the depth before, they've essentially made it their career's work to be able to convince non-technical audiences about, very complex concepts. And they have to essentially for lack of a better word, dumb down concepts so that their audience is convinced and will actually sway their decision in their favor. Um, so, oh yeah, I've got a pharmacist in training, as Saeed mentions in the chat. So definitely a good example of patient education, importance of that. Medical legal illustration work is actually a fascinating subfield of medical illustration, where it's actually the job of the illustrator to defend or, I guess, defend against the patient or the doctor in sort of malpractice lawsuits. Patient education, you're all probably a little more familiar with. And I'd love to kind of invite you to play a 60-second game with me. So bear with me here. It's going to take a little bit of imagination, but pretend for a minute that, you're on a jury. So, going into the sort of medical legal example here, pretend you're on a jury and you're sitting in a courtroom full of lawyers and you're tasked with determining whether a doctor is guilty or not guilty of a medical malpractice. So really quick game, I'm just going to show you two pictures, and I'd like you to type in the Zoom chat whether you think the image is being presented by the defense lawyer, so the lawyer, defending the doctor, or the plaintiff, which is, against the doctor, so defending the patient. So just type in the word defense or plaintiff when I show image A and image B. So again, the defense is defending the doctor, and the plaintiff is sort of against the doctor in this case. Okay. Okay. I'll show you the picture first, and then you can add in your answers. Okay, so this is image A. Let me know if you think this is against the doctor or defending the doctor. All right. You might change your mind if you said one or the other. I'm going to show you image B and then toggle. Exact same procedure, potentially exact same case, but now it looks very different. So you're saying defense, this image, yep. Image A again. Right. Okay, so it looks like about 95% of you are getting this right. So you can see how powerful the figures are just based on the color. Look how stark the difference is side by side. How an image could potentially determine the outcome of someone's entire career based on the quality of one image. Now, this is an extreme case, but just as every image you put into the world out there can be interpreted in one way or another. It's pretty crazy. I mean, I guess I can argue the ethics of exaggerating a story like this, but that's for another time. I personally do not get involved with medical legal illustration cases for this reason. But I think it's just so striking to see pictures like this and how much of a role visuals play in, convincing lay audiences. It's a jury. Usually it could be your mother, your aunt, your cousins who are going to determine, again, the outcome of someone's career based on a figure. So pretty remarkable. So thanks for playing along with me. Now you know a little bit about medical legal illustration. Again, patient education material, as I mentioned, is probably something a little more familiar to you. I actually used to volunteer at the Patient Education Library at Toronto General Hospital. Really cool initiative there. I was fascinated by how colorful and approachable many of the brochures and pamphlets were that describe diseases to patients and their families. You can see here that the color and simplicity and the serif fonts and diversity of representation of populations is really key to presenting relatable and approachable concepts to patients. And we should keep these concepts in mind when crafting figures to tell your scientific story. So the next few slides, I'll go through sort of some examples of effective patient education material. Here's a really cool one. I like the About Kids Health website from the renowned pediatric hospital here in Toronto called Sick Kids Hospital. Sometimes patients think that they actually have a disease if they have cells in the body, which I thought was crazy when I heard. So they think that even having cells in the body alone is a bad thing. Um, and they don't understand that the body is in fact made up of these tiny cells with genes that are blueprints, as is kind of being specified here in the description. And I think About Kids Health does a great job of sort of breaking down complex concepts like, what is a rough endoplasmic reticulum, which would, I think, be very difficult to explain to a child and their family. So, if you want inspiration on how to make approachable graphics for patients, particularly pediatric patients and their families, I'd recommend checking out the About Kids Health website by Sick Kids. This was an animation I created for a client a few years ago. And sorry about the watermark. This was just a sample I threw up on YouTube. But this client specifically was desperately trying to explain what cervical cancer was and why it was important to get screened early via a colposcopy procedure. So even that word is a bit of a mouthful. Apparently, the no-show rate for colposcopies had skyrocketed amongst low-income populations in the US, and they needed a simple animation showing the disease origins in the cervix, which is already sort of a touchy and uncomfortable subject for many people. And the reason for the high no-show rate was actually because, and I don't have the data here, I'm sorry, I can link it later in references, but it was actually because they were apparently scared of the photos when they Googled what the procedure entailed. So images like this and photos like this that are really invasive looking and anxiety provoking. So, again, pictures can do a lot to affect the health outcomes of populations if they're done poorly. So I'm not claiming that this is perfect, but this was sort of our attempt to create an animation that was simple enough to help demystify and comfort patients who were going to undergo a colposcopy procedure. In fact, this wasn't even the final animation. We had to revise the body shape to mirror a more average body type, which was slightly curvier, and also offer the video in a few sort of skin shades so that the video felt more relatable to populations that were most affected, which were primarily sort of Latin American and Black population in the US. So again, relatability is super critical. Yes, skin shades are important, as Geraldine mentioned in the chat there, to an audience who's already a bit nervous about taking in information from, a seemingly untrusted source. Okay. So for the last two tips, I'm actually going to navigate over to BioRender and dive into the demo to kind of show you what I mean in practice, because sometimes it's a bit easier to show, by example, as opposed to having me sit through some boring slides. So hopefully you can see my gallery view of BioRender. Now, I know many of you probably have never seen BioRender before. If you haven't, no worries. It's, super simple sign up process if you want to go to biorender.com and make your own account. For those that do know, I think hopefully you'll find a few more tips and tricks that will cover, that will be helpful for you in your figure making for science communication for the public. I just signed into my account. This is a web-based browser, web-based app rather, and the types of figures you can see here are pretty broad. So you can get pretty technical with the icons we have in this app. But what I'd love to show is kind of how you can, pull back a little bit and show more simple figures for, again, a lay audience. So navigating to my folder here of image examples. I'm going to sort of try to tie in some of the things that we talked about in the first few slides and go with an example here that was actually presented to me by a company that was trying to describe this seemingly complex concept to a broad range of audiences. So here's my before picture. I'm just going to put it off to the side here as reference. And, how do we make this figure more understandable and approachable for anybody who doesn't have a scientific background? First of all, I'm probably going to take some time to add in a nicer looking brain that's not sort of this like crayon looking drawing. I'm going to type in brain. And hopefully I'm not going too fast here as far as the usability of BioRender. We're not going to go through, exact features of how to use BioRender, but just know that we've got, thousands of icons here that you can pick from. And I like the vessels here. It's a little bit scary looking. If I had the time, maybe I'll just soften it a little bit. Maybe make it a pink color. I think that's pretty good. And let's see, I'm going to add sort of a bullseye color to it. I have one pre-made over here. Bring to the front. There we go. So it looks like there's a blockage. So this specifically is talking about sort of the anatomy of an ischemic stroke. So when parts of your brain lose access to oxygen because there's a block in one of the arteries. Pretty complex concept for somebody that might not know even what an artery is. So, I'm going to create this little bullseye similar to what they've done there. It's pretty good. It's simplified enough. I actually didn't notice that this little dot was a blockage. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy and paste that little circle, maybe make it a dark color. Let's see here. Oh, the opacity is lowered, so I'm going to increase the opacity. There we go. Oops. And then I'm going to just maybe block the artery further upstream like this. Could also make that a little bit darker so that it's more obvious from a distance. There we go. A little blockage there. And then labels here are going to be really important. So you can see here the definitions they've used are penumbra, ischemic core, and blockage. So already for me as a non-cardiovascular doctor or scientist, I don't really know what that means. They've done a really good job of defining what it is. So area of reversible damage and area of irreversible damage. Now, a lot of cases, for some reason, it works when you just literally flip the label with the definition when you're talking to a lay audience. So here's an example. I've just pre-typed it. I've literally just reversed the definition with the title so that the definition becomes the main label. So reversible brain damage, irreversible brain damage, and then blockage in a brain vessel. I'll maybe right align that like so. And also the order in which it's being read or consumed, the information, I'm reading it as, area of reversible brain damage, area of irreversible brain damage, and then blockage, which doesn't make sense. The blockage happened first, and then, the reversible brain damage happens, and then I assume irreversible at the end. So in order to read from, clockwise or left, right, up to down, I'm going to rearrange the order of those elements. So the blockage happens first, so I'm going to have it open on the top left. And then I'm going to make my labels a little bit more obvious. Center front. So this is the area of reversible brain damage. There we go. And then irreversible is in the middle, like so. And the blockage is over here. So also kind of, a bit of a plug into BioRender, how flexible these sort of label arrows are, which again is really nice for when you want to label a complex looking thing. You can kind of move labels out of the way by using the label lines with the elbows in them. So already much more effectively communicated. I could probably show this to somebody who doesn't have a scientific background and they'd hopefully get it right away. And great tip, Ravi, I would actually number them if it is that they're kind of a sequential order. So if the blockage happens first, I'd probably add in maybe a button here that says 1, and then 2, 3, Even better. And I love these kind of text and shape options in BioRender. You can actually just double click and change that. Maybe make it bold enough. So look at the before and after, just how much more clean and clear it is. And then, making the title very obvious: reversible versus irreversible brain damage following an ischemic stroke. So I think I've done a pretty good job there of a nice before and after image. Okay, I'll hit preview to see what that looks like. Oh, there's a typo in irreversible. Haha, thanks for catching that. Okay, great. Let's see, we've got time for probably one more. I'm gonna go ahead and save that. Oh, here's a good one. So talking about labels and, showing kind of scary things. I see this a lot where when we show pathologies or before and afters of, healthy versus unhealthy states, I always see these instruments kind of poking around the patient's body or, the diseased areas, and probably not necessary. Also, this sort of background color I'd remove. Um, as much as possible, as I mentioned, try to avoid really, really hyper realistic figures. Probably stick with the more schematic ways of showing things. So taking this as our before picture, I'm going to move this to the side, and I've got sort of a magically available figure in the back. And then I kind of liked what they did here with the before and after, where it was showing, I guess, a healthy state on the left and then a not healthy state on the right. It wasn't that obvious, though, that it was two different points in history. It looked like it was the exact same tooth, and one side was healthy and the other side was not. So in this case, as illustrators, we always use this kind of dotted line to show before and after states. So it kind of shows, that they're probably separated by time in some way. And then make that a little bit thicker. There we go. Now we've got healthy tooth and periodontitis as a sort of antagonist, protagonist of the story. As I mentioned earlier, I'd probably use label lines that have that dot at the end. And this is a really minor detail, but something that will take the figure from being, nice to just professional looking. There we go. And I also like to kind of, so the periodontal probe shows the depth of the pocket. Okay, that makes total sense. Thank you very much, Natasha, for describing that. So of course, if it has a purpose in the story, I would definitely include that in. I would even maybe have a call out to that deepening pocket. Maybe you can show the centimeters or the depth in numbers, as opposed to maybe showing that, cold instrument. It's all about kind of, putting yourself in that patient's shoes and seeing what they probably want to see and not want to see. Sometimes I'll even differentiate, if you want to take this a step further, differentiating labels from verbs and action items. So in this case, the deepening pocket is indeed this sort of area, but you could even take it a step further and use these kinds of faded, curved arrows to show a little bit more of an action. So the deepening pocket is actually going down like this. So, in a not so scary way, you can show that, this is maybe the pathology or the progression of the disease. Just a lot more effective than just pointing at it. So now I've differentiated the, I guess, anatomical regions as well as, actions that might happen to cause that. And then finally, a few final touches I'd probably add is creating color combos for. Oh, okay. Natasha's actually a periodontist, so she can give me some really good tips here on how to improve this figure. Thank you. Probably maybe, add a red to show the good guy, the bad guy, and the blue for the good guy there. I also have sort of a progression of healthy to diseased. So this is always nice to really show, public audiences. the kind of timeline that they might experience. Our artist had actually added this colored band to make it really obvious, take it even one step further. I'm going to change the canvas size here to make some more room. Like so. And I think one more element that I believe our artist had once used was even creating a very slight background to just drive the message home that maybe, one side, and if it's subtle or if you have some sort of color blindness, I apologies, but the left has a very slight kind of green hue. Maybe green's a bad color. More of a bluish hue. And then red is kind of, it kind of denotes inflammation or some sort of pathology. So, much more effective than this. I suspect, the purposes would be different and you'd probably label this anyway, but in any sense, it probably isn't even necessary to show the internal vessels. We just want to show the deepening of that pocket or maybe the progression of the disease here. So I think this looks pretty good for a before and after. Let's go hit preview. And it looks nice and approachable. I wouldn't be afraid to show this to my parents who, might not have a science background, but, should show up to their dentist appointment. And then, yes, absolutely, Geraldine. So not showing the vessels makes sense because people don't see the inside of their tooth anyway. So that makes total sense. Great. So I'm going to hit preview here. And if you want to export this figure, certainly hit your favorite file type and your resolution. I think that was my 5th tip, which was to make sure you format your figures for the intended purpose. So if you're going to be tweeting out about this topic and you want to attach this figure to your tweet, or writing an article, or just printing it out for some flyers or what have you, just make sure you're exporting it to the proper dimensions. So 300 dpi is good for print. 150 is actually pretty good for presentations without crashing PowerPoint, and then 72 is generally reserved for web-based applications like Twitter, or for blogs or online articles. So I'm going to go ahead and hit JPEG and 150 dpi, and it's going to save to my desktop here. And if I go back to my presentation, I can actually insert my figure by going to my desktop. There we go. And then one final tip that I'll leave you with as far as formatting your figures to be very specific for your intended audience. So sort of format image type for intended audience or media. Just gonna navigate to the sort of fake Twitter account I have. One thing that I discovered, and this is a little bit granular, so if you don't use Twitter, no worries. Twitter will actually crop any picture that you post unless you click into it. So as much as you can, if you do have video files or GIFs, for some reason, Twitter is forgiving for those and it'll maintain the entire size. So if I click into it, it's still that same size. But for pictures, for some reason, it'll crop it down. So if I click into this, the full size is actually a square. So just know that when you're formatting for pictures, for posts, say on Twitter, really maximize this dimension and make your pictures kind of fit this frame, because sometimes if you kind of lose the top half of your picture, you've lost sort of that punchline. So just keep that in mind. I'd even do like a little test post on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever it is before you go and post. Okay, so going back here, one thing that I'd love to share is, I know for those of you that are a little bit shy and maybe don't want to, put yourself out there or, get involved in conversations that are really important. Again, given that sort of infodemic pandemic in a way right now, there's actually this company or initiative called helpareporter.com. Now, I have no association with them, but I just thought they were pretty interesting because you can volunteer yourself as a source of trusted information. And I think, if you are all experts in your specific field, even if you're longtime student in the field and you find yourself being the authority in the space, definitely sign up for this. I think they just send you an email with, thematic topics from journalists who are looking for that dedicated source of information. Because if you don't speak up, then somebody else with probably not so much information or background about it will. And I think this is kind of one small step that we can do to kind of combat that misinformation being spread out there. So check it out. I saw a couple of other initiatives at the beginning of this chat of those that were familiar with some other initiatives. So please feel free to add those into the chat now. Here's your opportunity. There's quite a few attendees in the room, so they'll get access to that information. Yeah, and here's sort of a reiteration of the tips that we covered. So again, hopefully if these concepts resonate with you a little bit more than it did an hour ago, then I've done my job here. So use relatable visual analogies, kind of looking at that iPhone plug and, that Michael Phelps analogy. Number 2 is modify text and labels for a lay audience. So sometimes all you can do is just flip the definition and the sort of jargon or technical term, and that is good enough. Define the hero and villain of your story. Study examples of patient education or even medical legal whose sort of profession it is to kind of perfect that science imagery. And then format for your intended audience or media. Great. Okay, so thank you so much for joining us. And if you are curious, we have a lot of conversations happening in the Q&A. They're available there if you want to take a look at what your colleagues were inquiring about. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe. Have a great day. Take care.